Should be a... Oh, there we go. We've started. Oh, okay, so welcome to our first podcast, our first recording. I wonder, Nick, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your book.
Right, well, I'm Nick Ford, and I've written a book. This is the first book in a long time. I've had 3 others published. They're all fairly orthodox histories. I did them for money. This one I'd done for the love. 2 years ago, I was helping a friend move a narrowboat from a marina up the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, round about Wigan, down to the far side of Manchester on the Cheshire Stockport side. And this was a several days journey involving negotiating 5 or 6 different canals that are part of the network that go through and in some cases under bits of Manchester. Quite an interesting trip. And we were talking en route about odd things that have happened on canals, including the canal we were on at that time. And as we swapped stories, I thought, well, if anybody's written a book, a compendium of waterways folklore. And it turned out somebody had more than 10 years ago, but that's just a collation of stories. It is said that here, this, and there, that. And I thought, well, how about something that gives us a why and a wherefore, and how are these things perceived, and how real are they? How real are they not? How do they tie in with traditional folklore? How much are urban myths, and so on. And as we were on this journey, as soon as the same day that we thought this would be a good idea, I made the decision to start on the book. 2 paranormal phenomena happened, and they're mentioned in the book. And yeah, as Jung said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people.
Indeed.
Particularly when they relate to place.
So do you feel that was the spirit of the local canal approving thoroughly of getting a bit of a biography written?
Oh, that's a thing. As you know, I imagine all rivers in pre-Roman Britain seem to have been venerated as individual gods or goddesses. And they've got their names, and sometimes the names are so sacred, well, we're not going to tell any bloody Roman what they are. That's the Avon, isn't it? The Abona, meaning in Brythonic, the river. Or Derwent, the white water, and so on. They're descriptive. We often don't name them.
Yes.
There are a few cases where you do, like Werbea, the deity of the River Wharfe, who still demands a sacrifice of 1 human life every year. Fact. Yeah. And is this true of canals? Well, what is a canal? It's one of 100 artificial rivers that were constructed for the most mundane of reasons between about 1750 and 1850. And in some instances, they're bits of river, naturally occurring river that have been straightened out, and rivers feed into them. And like we are, a river is a composite organism. We are a whole bunch of interdependent small lives. Most of those small lives aren't terribly conscious of each other. And the question is, we are self-conscious, but is another kind of multiple organism, a bioplasm, like a planet or a river, conscious of itself? The experience of the Celts and the Romans, for example, seems to have been, yes, absolutely. It's not just poetry. So the same will apply to a canal. A canal, as soon as they dug the canal, flooded it, in come birds, in come fish eggs on the legs of the birds. All manner of life starts to establish itself in these man-made rivers. And with those lives, maybe there come other lives. Certainly, many people died in the navies, in the construction of those artificial waterways. And the most haunted and the most numinous, not necessarily in a good way, but the most atmospheric parts of our canal system, like the Harecastle Tunnel, for example, are sites where some pretty horrible things have happened. Industrial accidents, you've had suicides, murders, and so on. So yeah, some people end up in the canal, and they say that it is said that a spirit cannot cross running water. Well, canals appear to be still, but they are running. They're running from one level to another, albeit very slowly often. But I think sometimes once in the river, are we perhaps all prisoners of our own belief about what happens to us in the hereafter? If we think it, so it is for us until we're shown different. So you get spirits that haunt canal towpaths, haunt canal bridges, scream in tunnels, and so on. And if you're a river spirit, not necessarily the collective essence and identity of a whole river, but let's say some water nymph or other. And during the Industrial Revolution, let's say you're in a part of Manchester or Birmingham, for example, which is rapidly being urbanized, and your little stream starts off as an open sewer, then it gets culverted, and then it starts feeding a canal. Well, you're going to move out, aren't you? And you're not necessarily going to be well disposed to the humans that have done this to your original home. So you might vengefully, like Ginny Greenteeth, lure unwary children into their doom. And there are others, there's Peg Powler and one or two other spirits that really do seem to have it in for people. And, you know, if that's what happened, I can't say I really blame them.
Indeed. Have you ever read a novel by Ben Aronovich called
I've read all of them.
All of them.
All of the Rivers of London series, yeah.
Yes, I like the idea of the people who drowned in the various respective rivers becoming the vessels for the consciousness of the river.
Yeah.
And sort of dragging their soggy bodies out to acquire a semi-divine status.
I could believe it.
Indeed, yes. I've no idea what Ben Aronovich's religious outlook on life is, but I can't help but think there may be a bit of genuine inspiration there coming forward in his writings. That does seem to me, and a while ago I had a bit of a mini fixation on train tunnels, particularly the idea of, much like you're saying about canals and the sheer volume of people in the older train tunnels who died, the navvies and what have you, in the making of them, and the blood spilt, as well as all the suicides and the murders and so forth that have taken place over the intervening numerous decades. Whether that embodies, and it seems to me it does, it embodies the various, particularly the underground lines, even more so than the overland train lines, that they have their own lares, their own presences animating them.
Now, here's another thing. Old railway tunnels, old railway lines, canals, particularly like the bits I was on through, a particularly unfashionable part of post-industrial Manchester, where you don't get holiday trippers. in hire boats. There was one stretch where we were a manifest subject of curiosity by the locals because they couldn't understand. There was the cut. Yeah, sure, your cut's always been there, but it's what you dump mattresses in, or maybe bodies. You don't use it for transport. God, what a novelty. What are you doing? We're moving house. What do you mean? This is the house. We're moving it. It's on the canal. So many stretches of canal are quiet. They're uninterrupted by the busyness and the ebb and flow, and we might say the electromagnetic interference of constant human activity. So you seem to get an atmosphere, shall we say, that predisposes a suggestible individual like myself for liminal things to happen. It's more likely to happen because there isn't the atmospheric interference. It's also more likely to be registered as happening when you're in the dark and your most ancient instincts are kicking in. Your sixth sense is just, your radar is just looking around. Whatever you think, it's doing it, and it's programmed into your oldest DNA to do it. Nothing you can do about it.
Indeed.
It's always trying to detect something unusual, something other, something different, something that may be inimical. Ever since your first ancestor stepped into a cave with a stick and just hoped there wasn't something hungry in the darkness at the back end, you know.
Absolutely. Just picking up on that point about the stillness that comes from disuse. Something that's occurred to me when don't take it the new dog quite so much as often as I used to with the old dog, because he's very antisocial with other dogs, and the river path just over there, it's very narrow, so there's nowhere to haul him off to if he gets shirty with some dog coming in the opposite direction. But the previous dogs, the ones you've met, were much more friendly, so I used to take them up the river path quite a bit. And although that bit of the river Gipping, I don't know if it fully classes as a canal, but there are sections of it that were human
Yeah,
interventions.
navigation.
Yeah. But it has almost no river traffic on it anymore. Once every third blue moon, you see somebody in a canoe going up and down for a bit of pleasure boating, but beyond that, hardly at all. And I wonder if partly that it obviously has an impact on the plant life, particularly the amount of pondweed that builds up that would have been kept moving if there were constant traffic going up and down, that now just sort of coagulates from one bank to the next. But also, if beyond simply the kind of botany of the situation, whether that leads to almost a spiritual malaise, for lack of a better word, that something that was designed for usage that doesn't get the usage, like a book sitting on a shelf that no one reads, does it become disgruntled? Does that lead to a certain, even if initially maybe the river spirits were quite, as you say, peeved that some bloody bunch of humans had come in and straightened out their river course and done whatever they'd done, and they might be quite resentful of it. But if part of that repurposing is for the intent of human usage, and suddenly humans stop using it, does it breathe a sigh of relief and think, thank God for that? Or does it start to get resentful?
As I see it, anything that exists, that is alive, needs to eat. Anything that is terms non-physical, as we understand it, not carbon-based, but electromagnetic, needs to eat electromagnetically. And therefore, yes, I can see that a watercourse that's used to getting some kind of feed off the presence of humans will miss it. I can see that it may be necessary, it may be thought necessary sometimes, felt necessary, when one comes along at last to engender sheer, blind panic, terror, to get a supercharge of electromagnetism, which it can suck up. And a bit like a python swallowing a goat, that'll do it for the next 6 months or whatever, go back to sleep again, you know?
Yes, glutting itself.
Yeah.
I've certainly had encounters with entities that felt like they were up to that sort of behaviour. Not a pleasant encounter, I have to say, but
Yeah.
yes, wouldn't surprise me in the least. There's, I'm reminded of the traditions, the Roman traditions around the Lares Viales, and the sense that when you're, well, in ancient times at any rate, people were about to engage on a long journey down one or other of the Roman roads, they would make a sacrifice, and as memory serves, I think it was chickens, to the Lares, to the spirits of the road, that they should arrive whole in one piece, unmolested, etc., at their final destination. And which has led me to wonder if, you know, since we've abandoned that practice, whether the roads make their own arrangements, hence the ridiculously large number of accidents that take place, not just down to crap driving, but thirsty roads.
It is
And maybe
something.
the same for rivers, canals.
It is something I do, incidentally, when setting out on a journey. Often it's not a material, in the human sense, a material sacrifice of food and drink, although sometimes, yes, it is. I think what really matters is the intent and the address of prayer, the broadcasting, the energy broadcasting that is focused, directed, willed prayer is something that directly benefits them. Not just gratification at being paid the compliment of recognition that they exist, but actually a direction of electromagnetic force as food.
Yes, I'd go along with that wholeheartedly. It's maybe something that more people need to be encouraged to do when they're using, whether it's roads or canals or whatever kind of, maybe train lines as well. Wouldn't surprise me if there was a Lare for, well, I don't know what the Latin word would be there. But
I can tell
for
you, they're the lares ferroviales.
the iron ores. Perhaps
And
they
did
should
you
have.
know that the spirits of dead railwaymen, I used to work on the railway a long
Yeah.
way back in a post-industrial sort of way, and there was a law that railwaymen who are killed in accidents, which are, you know, quite common on the permanent way, being knocked down by a train, tend to haunt that stretch of road as a crow.
Yeah.
Yeah, very odd that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That could have been a nice addition if somebody had mentioned that to Dickens for his signalman.
So when about to embark on a long train journey, to avert its perils, get on the good side of the Lares Ferroviales.
Feed the crows.
It's yeah, why not?
Well, absolutely.
Anyway, it's all about respect.
Yes. I wonder if one day somebody in the future might be having this discussion around spaceports and the intergalactic highways between planets or whatever it is that they zip around between 500 years in the future. Or indeed, maybe the internet highway, whether there are entities there demanding the great spider beings of the web demanding their blood and taking it in the form of all of the shrieking and hollering and absolute bloody lunacy that goes on.
Well, you know, gremlins are gremlins evolved with the Royal Flying Corps, did they not? I don't know whether the German Luftwaffe or the Tsar's fleet of flying ships in the Great War, they also evolved a mythology about mechanical faults being caused by mischievous entities that perhaps crawled into the engine space because they were attracted by the warmth, and a hefty whack with a spanner would dislodge them, turn them on their way. But the idea of the gremlin, it's continued. I think they've migrated into cyberspace. I really do. There are imps of perversity, I think, that like to cause misunderstandings and cause what used to be called flaming. People getting the wrong end of the stick of what the other person is saying in
Yes.
internet messaging, that sort of thing. Makes you wonder.
Well, given the amount of shit and grief caused by the internet, I'm sure there's some entity somewhere feasting quite intently upon all of that psychic angst that seems to come about. But I suppose put it down mostly to human incompetence, but I suspect there's something taking full advantage of our inability to communicate effectively.
Mm.
There was what was he, Lithuanian philosopher Emanuel Levinas, who some decades before the invention of the internet argued that things like the telephone were causing disruptions to the development of human morality, because his argument being he lived in Paris, so he wrote in French rather than in Lithuanian. So he spoke about the tete-a-tete, the fact that almost the whole of human existence, because so few people could read and write, the vast majority of communication took place face to face. Therefore, you can see if you're annoying someone or making them laugh or upsetting them or whatever you're doing to them. And it takes a singular kind of bastard to upset someone to their face and not care. Most people will care. So his argument being that morality fundamentally develops because we have face-to-face communication. And so to him at the time, the telephone being his main worry, non-facial forms of communication he felt would lead to higher levels of cruelty, as people lacked the body language, the engagement, the immediacy, would become more and more unpleasant. Which obviously, the internet is his idea magnified 1,000-fold.
Just like the invention of long-range projectile weapons.
Yes.
You don't even see the people that you are dispatching. No interaction with them at all.
Yes. Press 3 buttons and 1,000 people cease to exist.
Again, lack of respect.
Yes. I wonder how perhaps the smithing deities regard. Now we've moved away from the days of swords and into the days of electronic destruction. Whether that's...
You may remember that Hephaestus created thunderbolts for Zeus. That's a pretty long-range weapon, but Zeus could see perfectly well who he was. Still long range, mind.
True, rather more targeted than most of the missiles that go whizzing about these days. Go back to the canal spirits. Obviously, that's very centered for everything you said so far in an animist understanding of the world, of all of the beings and entities, human, animal, plant, and electromagnetic, and whatever else might be out there. I was going to say it's a standard pagan view, but then I thought maybe it isn't. It used to be. I would have said in the ancient world something that just about everybody would have taken into account. Whether that's
It's
true
not a
in modern pagans.
neo-pagan thing, as far as I can make out, to generalize horribly. The way it's done these days is you pick a pantheon, maybe one particular patron out of a pantheon, and you do that cultural thing that you understand goes with it. And that's actually contrary to what the Romans and the Celts did, certainly, and the Greeks. You don't bother the big gods unless, firstly, you've got a nice big barbecue to offer them. Cost you an ox, or a sheep. The price of a modern mid-range car now, who's going to talk an Audi 600 to get the attention of nuclear optimists.
Certain council estates.
Oh yeah, yeah. Somebody else's usually. Yeah,
Yeah.
the big gods. I've I've addressed some of the great big gods sometimes and wished I hadn't, because the feedback I got was, "What do you want, little person? Yep, you're not doing this right. Where's me peg?" On one occasion, was, I'm not having anything to do with this. Where's me peg? You have seriously pissed me off now. I want my peg. This rite has always been performed by cutting the throat of a pig. You clearly don't think it's that important, do you? That's me thinking, oh, she's going to be so gratified that after such a long time, I'm going to celebrate Kerry Alia. She'll be honoured. No, she was hacked off. I haven't managed to negotiate an acceptable substitute, so I've just steered clear of that since. No, it's small gods for small things. Numina.
Yes.
Ancestors, little spirits of place. You don't necessarily know what they are, you just give them a vague name of Lares, elves, Penates, Numina. And unfortunately, there's not that much discourse in classical literature about the nature of these beings. And I've never satisfactorily been able to find anyone giving a definitive opinion of what is a numen, as opposed to the numen of a god. Just for example,
There's I think it's Norwegian, if I remember rightly, description of a farmer's land in which there's a hill, burial mound on his land, and there's granddad and great grandmother, and generation after generation after generation interred in the hill on the farmland, and not all of them, but there's reference to some particular especially accomplished ancestor who has perhaps maybe a little bit like the Christian notion of a saint. They're not just any old ancestor, they've gone up a level and become an elf, which isn't to say that all elves
no,
are ex-human beings, but just that there is the possibility that some entities that we think of as little gods, for lack of a better term, may have been human at some point along the line. But presumably not every human becomes one of these things, otherwise, well,
back to an
great
animistic
chaos.
view here.
Yeah.
Siberian shamanism, for example, holds the belief that a spirit in a tree can be reborn as a human and vice versa, or as a dog, or as some kind of elemental. Yeah, it's just apparently a matter of habitual attitude and how this entity considers itself, that it will seek re-expression. And so if you're in a rock, if you're a gnome, for example, you've got a long time usually before you need to consider a change of vehicle. Similarly, if you're a waterway, but if you're a tree, or even more so if you're a human, it's as far as choice does come into it, Buddhist law seems to suggest that the karma of attachment causes people to wish to repeat their experiences and repeat their expressions and choose a very similar vehicle, to the extent that that regression hypnotherapist, what was his name? Oh, Bloxham, Arnold Bloxham. He compiled some tens of thousands of case tapes, and the overwhelming majority of validated apparent reincarnation, pre-life experiences, past life experiences, seem to occur within the same linguistic group, usually the same bit of geography and the same gender. It's less so gender, but more so linguistic group and place, which is interesting.
It's very reminiscent of the belief you find in some of the Irish texts that people would reincarnate, if they were favoured, they would reincarnate as their own descendants, so they'd remain within the same clan. And you get various kings saying, claiming, even in the Christian period, that they were reincarnations of some great, 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 much revered ancestor who'd come back again. So that
Tom Keating, who carried on Arnold Bloxham's work, found that in India, this is significantly the case. Reincarnation within families. A teacher of mine actually suggested it might be much more common in our part of the world than we realise. And that, well, the way he put it was, if you really thought about it, it would just put you off having sex, because you never know, there might be n number of discarnate great aunts and great uncles just waiting for that moment of conception to incarnate their essence into a bit of cellular fusion,
Possibly not too long after you've only finally managed to get rid of them. What a prospect.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it would marry quite nicely with genetic notions of people looking very much like great granddad or whoever, that features, behavioral traits repeat, that maybe it's not merely a genetic quirk, but a whole package, spirit included, of a repetition of somebody come back for opportunity number 2, 3, 4, however many times around they've been.
Absolutely. And we read of transfiguration as a thing among spirit mediums, where the medium having gone into trance will sometimes take on the facial characteristics, as far as plasticity of flesh and blood allows, of the deceased, or the person there being the medium of.
Yes, vocal traits as well.
Yeah.
What an uncommon one, of the re-echoing. Do you go down the, shall we say, Egyptian route, although other routes are available, of regarding the soul as a multiple layered entity, so that reincarnation does not preclude continued, as in reincarnation of one bit of you does not preclude the continued existence of other bits of you?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a several stages rocket, like the Apollo moonshots. Bits are left behind at different levels, and in the planet's field of gravity, atmosphere, and beyond. Yeah. Seems to me supremely logical. If a wholly human being is doing what a human being should, or what nature intended the human being to do and to be, perhaps this is so, and perhaps this is attainable by some people today. Our possibilities, I think we limit our possibilities by language, don't we? So we have more or less one word, soul, one word, spirit, and a more recent cultural heritage would have us think that there is only one.
Yes.
But then soul and spirit come from two different etymological roots. There is a distinction between soul and spirit in Hebrew, in Latin, in Greek, in Welsh. And it's a duality. That's a duality, but it makes me think of the Gnostic doctrine of the rational soul and the natural soul. That when you're born, what animates you, the animus is just a charge from the cosmic battery, if you like. It's intelligent, but it has a collective merging when a dollop of it isn't in use, a bit like the Dominion in the Gamma Quadrant. You know? How to put it to somebody who doesn't know Deep Space Nine, I don't know. Or
doesn't know Deep Space Nine.
That chap who wrote the Bartimaeus trilogy about an alternative timeline Britain in which magicians run the whole thing. And all these magicians are demonologists. And the demons hate the wizards because every time a ritual is done, they are dragged out of their natural state, pandemonium, which is they're all merged, just enjoying a composite, collective, peaceful existence. And then a piece gets torn off because that piece is nameable and controllable and fixed in a circle or whatever and told to go off and do stuff. And the only consolation one of these disgruntled genies or jinns or afrits or whatever, there's 7 ranks of them, by the way, can get is to obey the magician word for word and to the letter, hoping that one day the clever bugger will undo him. But it's that idea of pandemonium and that collective existence of soul, like a spirit-like entity. Yeah, so that's the other cultural parallel to the Dominion. So that's the natural. That's much the natural soul. What the Greeks called the pneuma, the breath. The psyche, however, is the individual soul. And there's a curious little verse in the 23rd Psalm, at least in the Greek Septuagint version. You know, the King James version has it as "He restoreth my soul." Well, the Septuagint version says "He gives me back my psyche," because you've been given a soul. From this soul, because you're alive, you build through magnetizing the blood, actually, a second soul, which we can call the blood body. Some people call it the astral body. You can call it psyche. You can call it the anima, or the nefesh, or the anyway. And that is yours to keep because it has been created. It has been developed out of the existence of that natural soul. He returns my soul to me, my psyche. Some people don't manage to do that, I understand, and that's what St. John calls the second death.
Slightly, I wonder if that's where Ouspensky got his idea of the soul having to be something that is created, which does lead the somewhat depressing prospect that anyone who dies before they've created it
Yeah,
essentially just is gone,
yeah,
ceases to exist, which
yeah.
is a grim prospect for anyone who loses a child, that they just haven't been around long enough to make that soul, make that
Yeah.
divine spark. But it's
No,
possibly
it's not. It's not a
rooted in that
comfortable
idea.
prospect.
No.
It is a belief I subscribe to, and one can, um, if one does have um, an essence, it will still require electromagnetic feed, and that because I mean normally the physical body produces it by its alchemy of turning carbon-based food into electromagnetic food. But it also feeds, the soul also feeds on conversation, on inspiration, on sunsets, on love,
Yes,
whatever.
I'm reminded of the altars that Roman households used to have to the paterfamilias to make offerings like candles, pour libations to the soul of the head of the family, in the hope that the soul would grow and make the more, I suppose, what we would call an ego, a conscious mind, wiser, kinder, more admirable than it had previously been by developing and feeding the soul, which obviously in slightly less male-oriented days, we might well argue could be done to the mater familias or any other variation thereof, not necessarily just to the male head of the household, but to anybody in a sense, and
Mm.
almost makes me want to remind a bit, going off at slight tangents, the Jehovah's Witness objection to birthdays as being this terribly pagan idea may not be without some foundation in that half the point of birthdays and celebrating the fact that somebody is still alive after another 12 months is to feed their soul, not just to give them cake and presents, but to
Absolutely. Genium indulgere is the phrase, I believe. I've got to leave you for a moment. Can we call a break?
yeah, I'll pause the recording. I think yep, that's working. Okay. So picking up where we left off with the book from earlier, having written one about canalways, do you think there's inspiration to follow up with one connected to other forms of strange manifestation?
I've I've had a thought about maybe rivers, particularly the non-navigable rivers, the ones that I haven't included in the book, but which nonetheless have a lot of lore and phenomena attached to them. So that's a possibility. Um, if I add on lakes, wow, lakes, that's probably worth a book in itself. Yeah. And I've also had a thought about a companion volume to railways.
I would definitely be interested in the railway one.
But
Not
I
that
need
I'm a train spotter, I hasten.
to see what the publisher says.
That would definitely be an interesting one. There's some really good books about alleged railway ghosts and so on,
Mm.
hauntings of various stations and sites of derailments and what have you.
Well, again, they
Railways.
are liminal places.
Yes.
They're neither here nor there. They're on the way between the two. And yes, if you're stuck there, you're like fallen through the crack between one world and another.
Did you ever, going back quite a few decades now, see Sapphire and Steel? It's
No.
Joanna Lumley and David McCallum as these two strange entities. You never really find out what they are, but they're not human. And there's one of their series was set in a train station which was haunted by all sorts of strange spectres linked to the waiting room, and beings that couldn't move on, and their job was to try and move them on, and then, well, it all went a bit pear-shaped. And, quite a fascinating idea. One bit of lore for as a sort of storytelling activity some time ago, a few years ago. We had a series of train-related stories, which led to a bit of research into folklore. Rather than just making stuff up, I wanted to do actual kind of agreed upon train stories. And going back to the Edwardian period, possibly earlier for that matter, many train stations had a specific room to put bodies in should somebody either die on the train or jump under a train, or whatever might happen to them. So there was a not just a waiting room for the living, but a waiting room for the dead as they awaited the undertaker to come and ferry them away.
Also, were they before mortuaries were established, about 1870, coroners' inquests were held in designated public places, and as often as not, they were held in pubs. It's incidentally why a lot of canal side pubs are deemed to be haunted, because they were used first as mortuaries and then as the coroner's inquest bodies. And it could be that yes, that's where the deceased individual
Remains to some extent.
remains, unable to move anywhere else.
Yes, there's a tradition I found in a number of cultures, Ireland for one, some of the Nordic cultures for others, where a group of people is said to arrive in the new land, and within a matter of minutes somebody dies by accident or whatever, and they're immediately interred in the land, and that thereby seals the deal, as it were, that this land now belongs to this new group of people because their dead are in the soil.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if to an extent, going back to things you were saying earlier about creating the canalways in the first place, and the volume of navvies and what have you that died in the process, almost as if there's an expectation that if something is not given, it will be
taken,
and that there has to be some sort of sealing of blood and bone, gruesome as a topic as it is, with the new territory, or the new canalway, or the new railway, or the new whatever it may be, to bond the people who are to use it with the place.
It seems very likely.
So I'm not quite sure how we should go about incorporating that into future building plans. Might get a bit Fred West with the extension.
Oh Lord. Yeah.
Was it the Philippines? Oh, I think under the Marcoses regime, where they were building a sports stadium with slave labor, and a bit like they did in Russia when they were building a lot of the train stations and damming rivers and what have you, with prison labor, which was, as we all know, just glorified slave labor under another name, as the poor buggers died of exhaustion rather than pausing to move the bodies out of the way. They would just concrete over them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these structures have layers of people interred within them, not simply in the kind of the Cray twins propping up a flyover with their murder victims, but state-sponsored slaughter.
Yeah.
Possibly not quite the same thing, but it must have an effect on the nature of place, to have all of those people, their misery and their grief and their suffering, and the lack of proper respect for the dead.
Sure. If you've ever visited the battlefields of the Western Front, and had read books like Under Fire by Henri Barbusse, where he speaks of trench ramparts being built up of corpses and then getting covered over with earth, and people hanging their kit, their knapsacks or whatever, on a protruding arm or leg. And how many of those were all carefully removed and respectfully buried? Or when you think that a dozen or so are being turned up every year, still, even now, more than 100 years on, I think not. And there is certainly a miasma to those places, a sense of appalling sadness.
Yes. It was not uncommon at one point to collect up the bones and grind them down for bone meal to go into farmers' fields. Which, before that, they were sort of making an effort to care about working class soldiers. They were just dead and sold off as, well, in effect, as manure, basically.
Oh, and don't forget the teeth. Teeth are good for making dentures for people who can afford it. No, I understand there were enterprising people equipped with pliers going around the day after Waterloo.
Oof.
Imagine.
Yes.
This is our modern culture. It is devoid of respect.
Yes.
And who knows what price is paid as a result of that lack of respect. Just because you don't believe in vengeful ghosts or believe in an afterlife, you're all right. You're less likely to perceive what you don't believe in, but you will still be subject to it because it's there. And in a way, you are more vulnerable because if it doesn't like you, it will have you. And if you're not looking,
yes,
nah.
Might explain a lot of the negative things that happened to people over the years. These looming presences in certain locations. Trying to move on to a cheerier subject. Depressing myself now, let alone anyone else. Engagement with spirit. I know you've got your allotment that you make extensive use of. Do you find a kind of benevolent presence in the land alongside the slightly gloomier ones that we've been talking about so far?
The allotment does seem to have a sort of genius loci, and what it is, I don't know. But occasionally it turns up in a sort of elderly, masculine way, and suggests that I do something differently. However, it's at a place called Richard's Castle. And the Richard in question built his castle in 1042, and the village, it necessitated a village to maintain it, having built it. And I've turned up on that allotment bits of pottery that go back to the 11th century and shards from every intervening period. Now, it's just outside the village. Clearly, people have broken a pot, swept it out into the yard. It's gone onto the muck heap, and when the muck heap is big enough, it gets loaded onto a cart, trundled a quarter of a mile down the lane, upended onto a field, and spread. Where we're at used to be common land until it was enclosed in the early 19th century. So there will have been people tilling that land an awful long time. Particularly for most of the period from 1042 to about 1820, they will have been doing it in a sort of form of allotment. Field strips. So yeah, there is. I can't quite get a handle on it. I don't know whether it's multiple or singular.
Perhaps it's old Hobden making himself known.
Hmm.
Yes. Um, Speaking of old Hobden, um, are you still as enthused with Kipling?
Oh yes, oh yes. There's still a few more verses of his I would like when time affords to set to music, see how they sing. And there's something about the verse structure, just about all of Kipling's poetry. He was tone deaf, but Carrie Kipling remembered that he would compose alone in his study at Bateman's, and she could hear him pacing up and down and sometimes stomping out a rhythm when he tried to invite the words to dance in this set. That was the verse to be.
Yes.
Um, it is very musical poetry. The words dance. It's just a question of cocking an ear and listening for the tune that they're dancing to. Yeah.
I've had well, slightly over a year of obsessing about Oscar Wilde, and some of his pieces, poetic pieces, are meant to be set to music, but there's no, well, so far as I know, there is no indication as to what the notations would be. And sadly, I'm also tone deaf. I've got a hope in hell of
Yeah.
working out what the tunes would be. But it has led me to speculate to what extent the dead and gone poets of yesteryear occasionally crop up, and much like um, Jung's quote about ideas having people, whether sometimes poets have people and demand an audience long after they've departed the mortal realm,
It wouldn't surprise me.
acquire
In
themselves
those
a living
cases.
vehicle,
Hmm?
acquire themselves a living vehicle to promote and revive.
Yeah, I've encountered people who claim to have channeled this or that composer or writer, and most of the time I fail to be convinced.
We did have somebody like that come along to a moot many, many, many years ago. And frankly, I thought mad as a bloody stick.
But it's possible. It is possible.
You never know. So,
I
I,
sometimes feel my grandfather around, who was a writer and a poet, and but then again, I'm carrying some DNA of the old boy. So I don't know whether my elbow gets jogged and my ear whispered in, or whether it's just imprinted in the genes. Yeah, my mother was convinced that I was my grandfather. He died before I was born, until he turned up at a spiritualist seance that my mother was attending during my lifetime, saying, very, very busy, can't talk now, but I'm all right. Yeah. Just checking in, kind of thing,
yes.
which my father actually said was exactly like him. So it is possible. One doesn't know. I
Well,
try and believe in everything. I try and keep my consciousness open to as many possibilities as possible, because belief censors perception. I don't want my perception censored. This side of madness, you know. uh, I believe in the tooth fairy. I have no reason not to believe in the tooth fairy. I believe in the Virgin Mary. I have no reason not to. In fact, I've had a conversation with her more than once. So there you go. Or somebody purporting to be. That's another issue, the epistemology of identity.
good
None
discussion for another day. There's Oh, what was it? I can't remember the name of the author now, but a series of children's books, Guardians of Childhood, I think it's called, if I remember rightly, with the Easter Bunny and Santa and various kind of the Tooth Fairy, various luminary figures who exist chiefly as a product of belief. And there is a rather like one of those Terry Pratchett books, is it Small Gods, I think, where the lack of belief causes them to sort of shrink
Disintegrate,
down.
diminish, yeah.
Yeah. There's a sort of a plot line like that running through some of the books, that they have to sustain belief.
Hmm.
Going back to feeding off electromagnetic
Yeah.
presence
There
in
is
order
such a
to.
thing as an egregore.
Indeed.
The egregore, in magical terms, being an electromagnetic entity that is consciously created by a group of people. They wouldn't even try if they didn't believe it to be possible, but it's done through creative visualization and certain rights of empowerment or ensoulment. And yes, it's said of the astral light that to think of a thing in power is to create it in the realms in which it is possible for it to exist. And you and I, and anybody watching this, started their existence as a thought that passed between two people.
I like that idea. And grew and grew.
Mm.
Yes, it does open up a scary realm of possibilities, given some of the things that people believe in, especially if we're getting into the realm of internet paranoia about lizard people. And
Well, I mean, they're out there. You know, I'm convinced that there's a certain kind of nightmare a person can have. You know, it's not an ordinary nightmare when you sort of wake up, snap the light on, and think, "Thank God I was dreaming that," and often the feeling just goes away and it's normal again. You can put the light back out and you go back to sleep and you're not troubled again. There are other times when a miasma remains in the room, or there is some kind of deep-seated certainty in some part of you that it was real and that the threat is still ambient. And these I believe to be experiences in the astral rather than mere dreaming, just, you know, more than a mere surreal data dump
yes,
of cerebral impressions collected over a period of time that's just being cleared out, like defragging in tech speak. The lizard people, certainly, they're the stuff of which nightmares are made. I'm sure people have nightmares about lizard people.
well, there are certainly some things walking around claiming to be human, which probably are rather less human. Yes, sad to say. But it does, trying to end on a positive note, leave the opportunity for more creative thinking of a more upbeat nature to produce benevolent presences, as well as dwelling on the terrifying and the
Yeah,
ghoulish.
we should we should think respectfully and responsibly,
Yes,
not just the buildings we build, or the waterways we cut, or the railways that we put through the land, the thoughts that we think. I
absolutely.
wish I just thought a bit before starting HS2, incidentally, but the
Back to the
price you
lizard
pay
people
is
again.
terrible. The price you pay for people who don't have respect and don't think. And
Yes, it's. I think perhaps of all the things that are in short supply, respect is one of them at the
yeah,
moment. Um, Self-respect as well as respect for other living beings,
yeah.
human and non-human. We need a lot more of that in the world at the moment.
We do indeed. I wish every religion would rediscover its source of respect and widen its scope for respect.
Yes. The realization of personhood in a much bigger perspective than most religions allow. I think that's what's needed in the 21st century.
Yeah.
But therein is a topic for another discussion.
Indeed.
I think I've kept you long enough for our first endeavour into the realm of online discussions. Hopefully, there might be ones in the future.
I hope so. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I'll put up the links to your books once this is all edited and uploaded.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye-bye.